This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's mineralware.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to negotiate a better oil and gas lease. And Justin, before we hit record, we were talking about, the different scenarios. We see these very common questions again and again from members of the National Association of Royalty Owners that we've interacted with, or we see postings on the Mineral Rights Forum. And specifically, it's, related to usually, hey, I got this lease offer. What do I do? And so we're going to talk about some specific examples and things to think about if you are going through that lease negotiation process and maybe you come to a standstill in those negotiations or you're not happy with the offer that you're getting from the operator. We'll talk about some different options you have and what to look for. So, Justin, what are your thoughts as we think about this subject?
I think a lease is such a uncommon thing for most people. You go buy a car, you know that you're focusing on what is your payment and how much are you paying for the car. And in a lease, there's certain levers that are commonly pulled and that you have some ability to negotiate. And if this is your first time going through the scenario, knowing what those levers are is a whole world in and of itself to understand, Matt. And I think we talk a lot about how mineral owners have these common touch points. A lease is one of the most common and something that typically people are asking either, am I making the right agreement or am I getting the right price? And both of those take some research and some time to understand. So hopefully this will help really breaking it down.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Those are important concepts we'll talk about. The right price in terms of the lease bonus and then the right terms in terms of the royalty rate and other language in the lease. And we'll break that down. But I thought maybe it would be helpful if we talk about a couple of case studies. So we're going to use this example from Chip on the Mineral Rights Forum. You want to go through and kind of paraphrase his question. And then friend of the show and Oklahoma Narrow president, Martha Barnes, who's a frequent contributor to the Mineral Rights Forum and also with the National Association of Royalty Owners. And she has some great guidance I wanted to list as well. But we can use this question, I think, as a kickoff point for this topic here.
Yeah, so Chip says on the Mineral Rights Forum, my siblings and I have some mineral rights in Crater County, Oklahoma, and they've been getting royalties directly from Continental for the Bowery well. Corbett will be coming up soon, and we'll have to elect our bonus and royalty choices soon. And they've been contacted by a few third-party energy companies who will pay higher bonuses per acre and still pay the same royalty percentages. Is there a downside I need to consider before opting to go through a third party? And then what's our motivation for paying more than Continental or Turner? And Matt, this is an interesting question. I actually had this situation with a third-party lease, and it can be confusing. You think that going direct to whoever's producing the minerals would always be the best scenario, right? That's an easy assumption to make.
Yeah, that's a great point. But so Martha had a great answer here, and I fully agree with her guidance. And she says, my preference is to get the best lease terms possible for the best bonus and highest royalty pair. Many third-party offers will accept more mineral-friendly leases and give better bonus amounts because they want a piece of a good well. You can either lease or wait for pooling. The operator is still responsible for paying the royalties. And so what Martha is referring to with the lease bonus and royalty pairs, when you're force pooled, oftentimes the operator will make an offer, or even before force pooling, they'll make an offer that is contingent upon a couple of different things. One of them is the lease bonus per net mineral acre, and then the corresponding royalty rate with that lease. And usually it's as you would expect, you get a higher upfront lease bonus in exchange for a low royalty rate, and that sort of kind of ratchets up or down accordingly. For example, maybe it is $500 per net mineral acre for a 12.5% royalty, which is a 1/8 royalty, which is very low. And then maybe it's $250 for a 3/16 royalty. And then it's $0 bonus for 25% royalty. And people think, well, I'm obviously going to pick the highest lease bonus amount. That's the better lease, right? Well, not so fast. And we'll talk about why that is usually not the case. And before we get into the details, though, Justin, let's talk about negotiating tactics and tips and process, I guess, and why the first offer is almost never the best offer.
I think that's pretty true in negotiations to start with, right? We wouldn't buy a house at the first price listed. We wouldn't go buy a car at the sticker price typically. And leases are no different. The companies, these landmen are working for the oil companies, and their job is to acquire that lease at the lowest cost possible. That's how it goes. And the most favorable terms for them are not necessarily the most favorable terms for you. It's not a final take it or leave it transaction. An example, Mike from Weld County, Colorado, he had a lease that he was looking at. And he had the questions: how do we evaluate the terms of the offer, and what is it we should negotiate for? And at that notion to not accept the first offer is exactly right. And hopefully this will help you understand what the levers are that you can play with and what the benefit is long-term and both short-term.
Yeah, I think that is important when you think about the long-term benefits. And that's really, it's easy to get caught up in the upfront lease bonus and think that's the most important thing. But I think it's important to look at the bigger picture. And, that is also when you look at those initial offers off the shelf, that is going to be designed to be the most beneficial to them. And it's like any business negotiation, they're going to make an offer that gives them room to negotiate, hopefully to sign a successful lease that they're willing to agree to, and hopefully that you can agree to as well. That's from their position. So when you think about it from that standpoint, it's important to think about this as a business negotiation, and it's not personal. You need to go in there with very strategically and think about the things that you want going into that negotiation before you return a phone call and the landman or respond to the lease offer that you get in the mail. It's really important to think about the things you want to ask for and prioritize those things as well. And what are the things that you could give up that you really don't care about in exchange for getting maybe that higher royalty rate or no post-production deductions? And we'll talk about why that's important as well. But, I think the reason this is all important and why you need to spend some time thinking about this is if they drill a well or multiple wells and it's successful, it's likely that those wells are going to be producing for the next several decades, so 30, 40 years or more. And so what you agree to today will be in effect, and you'll be held to those terms for the next 4 decades, or your heirs will potentially. And you don't have a do-over. So that's one thing that people I see offer or see questions asked by mineral owners that, hey, I got this lease that is really unfavorable terms. I want to get out of it. What can I do? Well, the answer is really usually nothing. You really have no option. You're stuck with that lease. It's a contract that you've agreed to or your predecessors have agreed to, and you really have to play it out until the end of those terms before you can negotiate a new lease. And that means until those wells stop producing. So that's why it's important to think about this and take your time.
And to work with experts. And we'll talk about that a bit more as well. So third-party offers, Matt, I think this is, you're not really used to the industry. This is kind of confusing, and you wouldn't really be sure why these other companies would want to participate or sign a lease with you when they're not the one producing the minerals. So let's talk about just some of the scenarios where that happens. There's several different flavors, but some more common than not.
Yeah, I think the different things to think about and why they're willing to offer those leases to you, even if they're not the operator, not going to drill the well. It is the concept of becoming a non-operated working interest partner, and those that pay their proportional share for the drilling and completing of the wells are called non-operating working interest owners. So they are owners of an oil and gas lease, and when an operator proposes a well, they get an AFE, which is an authority for expenditure. It's basically a listing of the cost of drilling that well and what their share is going to be, and then whether or not they want to participate. In other words, whether or not they want to pay for their proportional share of the cost of that well in order to get their proportional share of the revenue and then also pay their proportional share of the cost. So, and the person or the entity that is doing that, participating in the well and partnering with the operator is called a non-op partner. And so you'll hear that term non-op working interest. It's kind of a short abbreviation for non-operated working interest partner. And the reason they want to do that is because it's financially beneficial for them to do that, especially if the lease is under a good operator. So that is, in other words, a good investment. And oftentimes these companies are backed by, high net worth individuals or private equity companies. And so, they're targeting a certain rate of return on investment, and they're willing to take the risk because they're participating in wells across multiple operators, multiple counties, multiple states. And so, if one investment doesn't pan out quite as well, then maybe they have another one that is going to offset that. Whereas those of us that are individual mineral owners, maybe we only have one or two tracks. And, if you participate in one well, you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and it's a big financial commitment. And if it doesn't pan out, then it's potentially a losing proposition. And so that's why oftentimes we recommend for mineral owners to not participate, because that is an option that when you get these lease offers, you'll also have the option to check the box and say, I want to participate in the well and pay my proportional share. And that could mean hundreds of thousands of dollars. I worked with a client recently who received AFEs for drilling some wells in Eddy County. They were considering participating, and I was just sort of went through the pros and cons with them and the potential outcomes. And ultimately they were not in the oil business, and so they decided that they wanted to sell the working interest and retain an override. So that's a small percentage of the future wells, and that's like a royalty interest, so they don't have to pay for the cost of operating. And if the well's a dry hole, well, they're not out anything and those types of things, but they get an upfront payment for selling that working interest. So that's a very important thing to think about, and why there are third parties that are willing to make more beneficial lease offers to you than the operator. And that's because they want to get in the door and be able to participate in that well. There's tax benefits for them. There's, again, those investment, options that they need to have, to spread out the risk across multiple basins and plays. And that's why they want to do it. It's just it's a good financial investment for them based on their business that they're in. And that's why there's no secret thing. Maybe they do want to flip it. So that's, worth asking what their motivation is. And we'll talk about some of those tips as well. But I think the end of the day, the thing to think about, if you get an offer from an operator and you're not happy with it, then find out who else is leasing in that county or in that township and be proactive and seek competing offers. You don't have to wait to get force pooled or to just deal with the operator if you're not happy with the lease you're getting. Get multiple offers to understand what the market is and to see what you can get. And that'll give you more negotiating power. That'll ultimately, hopefully, get you to that higher royalty rate that you want with better terms, and then, the lease bonus amount that you're willing to live with. I think that's important. But what are some of the tips that you can give around due diligence and questions to ask, that when you get that call from the landman, Justin?
So going back to Chip's question, is it strange that these third parties are contacting him and offering him a better deal? No, not necessarily. But, all of these third parties, fall into the same as operators. Some are good and some are bad. So asking questions, who are they working for? Are they trying to flip the lease? And Matt, we say flip the lease, but that would be acquiring the lease from you. And then for a higher lease bonus or for some benefit, they flip it off to the operator who is actually drilling that well, it happens as well. Are they wanting to be a working interest owner and get a copy of the lease draft to an attorney as soon as possible? Third party operator, whichever one is giving you this lease, because you want to be sure you have the attorney look at that for any terms that may not be favorable. And sometimes these can be written in a way that it's easy to miss if you're not, aware in this area. And so having a good oil and gas attorney that's aware of Oklahoma or whatever the area that you're in is very important. And Matt, something I think that gets missed with the third parties is even if that third party pays that lease bonus, the operator is still going to be responsible for the well and likely going to be responsible for paying your royalties or whatever contract pays your royalties. And so if you have a bad operator or somebody who's notoriously hard to work with, and you sign with a third party who's offering you good terms, you may not win at the end of the day because that operator is still going to be responsible for that, the royalties that are coming in.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're sort of not in control. Whenever you sign a lease, I think it's important to think that this lease will eventually get sold. That's pretty much a fact of the oil and gas business. At some point down the road, that lease is going to get sold, and those wells will probably get operated by another company. And that's why getting that stuff in writing in the lease is the key. And that's what the future operator, if it's not operator A today, it's going to be operator B later. They're going to have to follow the terms of the lease that you agree to, and that's in writing and that's recorded in the county if it's the full lease, or if it's a memorandum of lease. It's very important to keep a copy of your signed lease from both sides, so that you have that document that shows here are the terms. So because down the road, when that lease gets sold to operator B, they may lose a copy of your lease or may not be able to produce it. And if you can show them, hey, this is what you agreed to, we agreed to no post-production deductions, you're deducting it from my check, you need to stop that and reimburse me for the money you've taken out. And having a copy of that lease is your security blanket, so to speak, even though it is oftentimes recorded in the county, in which case that's maybe not as necessary. But more and more I'm seeing that the lessee will record what's called a memorandum of lease, which just states that there is a lease in place between the lessor and the lessee, and here are the terms of the lease, in terms of when the effective date of that lease is and when the primary term expires. And that's all that will say effectively. It won't show you the royalty rate or the no post-production language or other terms that you've agreed to. So that's why it's really important to have a copy of that final executed oil and gas lease with both the lessee and lessor signed on the dotted line, so to speak, so that you have that for your records or for your heirs down the road.
All right, Matt. So one of the most common things that we hear with leases is getting caught up on the lease bonus, right? It's a big shiny number, especially in some situations or at the height of leasing a few years ago. You could see these really large numbers for lease bonuses, but this can also be a tactic on the operator side of the person signing the lease to have more favorable terms long term. And we constantly tell people that royalty rate is the most important number in your lease, but it's a little bit different when you're staring down a 6-digit number that you're going to get all at once. So let's talk about the math of that and how it really not only impacts the check you receive every month, but the value of what your minerals are worth overall for the entire term of that lease, whether it be 40 years, 50 years, or however long that's held by production.
That's a great point. And the value of your mineral interests are going to be directly tied to the royalty rate that you agree to, because that determines how much you're paid in those future royalty payments over the life of any wells that are drilled. And that's usually more important than the lease bonus that's offered up front. And think of it, I guess, a couple of different ways. The lease bonus is like a signing check, right? You get that upfront payment in exchange for agreeing to that lease. And it's really what it is they're paying you the rent payments in a lump sum upfront to cover the primary term of that lease. So for example, if the lease is for a 3-year primary term, that lease bonus is basically the rental payment that's upfront, and it's paid to you to cover that first 3 years before the well is drilled. Once a well is drilled and that well starts producing, then the royalty rate will kick in, and that'll drive how much you're getting paid going forward. And the lease royalty rate is the percentage of the oil and gas that's sold, that you'll get paid. And basically it's your proportional share of that. More and more, we have a small fraction of the minerals, and, we're pooled with other tracts, maybe over a couple of different sections of land. And so it's our proportional share of that overall unit multiplied by our royalty rate determines what our decimal interest in those wells are. And just for the sake of illustration purposes, let's say that the well produces $10,000 per month in gross revenue from your share of production in the unit. If you have agreed to a 1/8 royalty or 12.5%, that means the monthly royalty is $1,250, and the annual royalty, just multiply that by 12, is $15,000 per year. And that's for that given year. That's if that were on average, how much you get per month. Now, going up the royalty rate ladder, so to speak, a 1/5 royalty, which is a 20% royalty, based on that $10,000 per month, 20% of $10,000 is $2,000 per month, and then that is $24,000 per year. Now, if you go all the way to the top royalty of 25%, that's 25% or $2,500 per month or $30,000 per year. And if you go back to that first example I gave with the 1/8 royalty, a 1/8 royalty in that particular case, that owner is going to get $15,000 a year in royalties. For the 25% royalty, they're going to get $30,000 a year or twice the amount. So that's why we say always try to get the highest royalty rate possible, because over a 20-year well life, and particularly if, new wells are drilled and, that keeps on adding up over time, and it can mean the difference between hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars if you have a big interest and there's a lot of really good wells, between like a 12.5% or a 25% royalty. And ultimately, that term will dictate the value of your property if you ever decide to sell. So if you have a 25% royalty, you can sell that property in the future for twice the value as compared to if you had agreed to a 12.5% royalty, just because of that simple math that we just went through. The annual royalty payments are going to be twice as much. So it stands to reason the value is going to be twice as high. So, and that royalty rate is the one lease term that is totally within your control. And that's one thing, it's always important to ask for, a higher lease royalty rate, unless they're offering you 25%. Most of the time, that's the top. I think in some very rare cases, large mineral owners have been able to get higher royalty rates than that. But generally speaking, that cap of 25% is usually the highest royalty rate that you'll see out there.
Absolutely, Matt. And it's the one thing that, like you said, is really in your control, and it's locked in for the life of the lease. And I think that's the thing that, it's easy to miss when you're just getting into this or it's your first interaction, but this is not something that you're going to change. And negotiating that higher royalty rate, even if you make concessions in other places, really has a major impact on the value of your minerals. And Matt, to talk a little bit more about that, we talked about how it is, it increases the value if you go to sell your minerals. But doing evaluations is something that you do routinely, Matt, for clients. How does that royalty rate tie to scaling everything? And, when you're looking at this in a calculation, it's really that the number one thing that determines how much it's worth, what is the value, because every drop of oil that's pulled out of the ground, or every marketable asset, you're increasing the percentage of that you own with the royalty rate.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, we do discounted cash flow modeling when we're evaluating the value of minerals and royalties. And that's just looking at all the future royalty payments and then discounting them back to today's dollars to understand what the property's worth today. And, again, it's because the payment that you receive is directly tied to that decimal interest in the well. And that decimal interest, or that net revenue interest is another term for it, is calculated by your net acreage divided by the total acreage that the well is producing from, and then multiplied by your royalty rate, just at the simplest level. And so again, it's directly proportional to your royalty rate. So a higher royalty rate means a higher decimal interest, which means higher future royalties, which means higher present value. Now, just as a way to illustrate rule of thumb, how much are we talking about here? One rule of thumb that is sometimes used is just a multiple of cash flow method. And that's where you take the average monthly royalty amount that you receive and you multiply that by, say, 60 times to give you the value of the property in today's dollars. Now, that works out okay if your wells are more than 5 years old and there's no possibility of future drilling and lots of other caveats. But really just think about this for the purposes of illustrating the impact on value from these different royalty rates that we mentioned. So I'll give you two examples. So the same net interest between two owners. Owner A agreed to a 12.5% royalty, and they're getting $1,250 per month in royalties. Owner B agreed to 25% royalty, and they're getting $2,500 a month. Well, if we multiply those by 60 times, $1,250 a month times 60 times, that's a value of $75,000. So if they went to go sell that, that's theoretically what they could demand for that property. Owner B, the value of their property is $2,500 a month times 60, which is $150,000 or twice the value of owner A. And again, this is assume that the same net interest in the same tract under the same wells, everything's identical. The only difference is the royalty rate. So the same well, same acreage, double the royalty rate, roughly doubles the asset value. So that's why we always say, always try to negotiate for the highest royalty. And related to that is language that will prevent the operator from being able to deduct the effective amount that you're getting paid. And do you want to talk about that?
Cost-free language, Matt. So this is something that, we hear a lot from mineral owners are, and this is kind of the other side of the table here. So we have a good royalty rate. We've checked that box. But let's say that we have some language that allows post-production deductions. So that is a case where, and this can depend a lot on the operator, Matt, the income from that can be eaten up by what it costs to put it in the pipeline, what it costs to market it, what it costs for gathering, compression, transportation, processing. And many leases have cost-free language that says, hey, this is based off of the gross production value and no deductions are allowed. And that's a much more beneficial to the operator, or excuse me, much more beneficial to the mineral owner. And Matt, going back to Chip's question originally, Martha mentioned that many of the third parties are more willing to negotiate favorable terms for mineral owners. And I would say the most common of that is cost-free language to ensure that that royalty doesn't get eaten up by the operator trying to charge back their costs to get that to market.
Yeah, that's a great point. And each state is a little bit different on what they allow the operator to pass on to the royalty owners. I have experience in Oklahoma where I've seen negative royalty payments for gas just because of those post-production deductions on some royalties that I have that have, pretty standard language, unfavorable terms, whatever, that did not have any post-production deduction limitations on it. And so I've seen things for gathering, for compression, transportation, processing, marketing, all of those things that the operator incurs in getting that raw gas from the wellhead to the through the gas plant to market. If they can, they're going to pass that on to the royalty owner. And the only real stopgap that you have is that cost-free language. And it's very important for this in particular to get help from an attorney because they can make sure the language gives you the protections that you think you're getting with those cost-free provisions. Because case law in each state will dictate how things are interpreted. And ultimately, really the only way to get a real assurance that you're getting what you think you're getting is to have an attorney review that. Now, it doesn't mean you can't go and look at other leases that were recorded in the county and copy some of that language in your lease, but then always have an attorney review it before you sign it because there may be some changes that need to be made to get the effect that you're going for. And then Martha Barnes also noted on the Mineral Rights Forum in her response that if she can't get a better lease with no post-production charges, amongst other things, then she has no problem with pooling. And I generally agree with that, particularly in Oklahoma. If you're a state with forced pooling, and then again, Oklahoma, because they offer generally the best pairs of lease terms with that final forced pooling offer. It's whatever they were able to get, all the best of all the other mineral owners that negotiated and had their attorneys review it and all that. You kind of get presented with the best of the best. And then you have to make your decision. Okay, then it's the trade-off between, the lease bonus and the royalty rate. And then, even if you're getting forced pooled, you can always try to negotiate a third-party offer as well.
So, Matt, one of the things I think that many mineral owners find themselves in the situation of holding the lease and trying to figure out where do I go to get some information. It's a natural thing for us all to want to get feedback from others that have been through the situation. And that can be a bit tricky when it's something so niche like oil and gas leases. Something we say a lot is talk to your neighbors. So if this is a property, you live in this property, people around this property, it's always good to talk to others and see if they've received offers as well. If they're willing to talk to you about what the terms of those offers were, it's a great place to start. Another great place, Matt, that is frequently used these days is the Mineral Rights Forum. It's a really great research tool. They have sections broken down by state and by county. And you can certainly get on there and ask if others have had an experience with this operator, what the lease bonuses have been in that area. And it's a very active community that can give you some feedback. Another thing I think that people fall into, and I've heard this before, is landman trying to create some urgency in the situation. So there are situations, Matt, and I'll let you talk about when it can be something that there will be deadlines that you're really up against. But also you have to be careful not to let them manufacture urgency in this, because you really want to take your time, compare offers, and you want to tell the landman, I'm going to look into this and I'm going to research this. and then I'll get back to you. And that lets them know that you're not just going to accept whatever they say at the face value, because you'd be surprised how many people do.
Well, yeah. So I would say that, to your point, another negotiating tip, in addition to not letting them use pressure tactics. Now, I will say that if you're in a forced pooling situation, of course, there are deadlines that you'll need to follow in order to preserve your optionality and not get forced into that highest lease bonus and lowest royalty rate pair that's getting offered. For example, if you're in Oklahoma and getting forced pooled there. So that's important to be timely when you respond to those. And if you do get a third party offer, you got to negotiate it and close it before you get forced pooled. Otherwise, that option gets taken off the table. Always also remember to just get everything in writing and don't agree to just what the landman says over the phone. Most of them are trustworthy and they're going to treat you fairly, but doesn't mean that there's not bad actors out there that could tell you one thing, but then what you actually signed is something different. And unless you're careful, you could get the rug pulled out from underneath you. And then again, always work within a good oil and gas attorney, not just any attorney. This is somebody that understands oil and gas leasing in the state where your minerals are located, can help you draft those terms that you're looking for. And if you have, again, thousands of dollars on the line, even just with the lease bonus, that'll help pay for that attorney. And that's going to mean the difference between potentially preserving the value in that property and settling for a lot less and leaving money on the table down the road.
And they're worth their weight in gold, Matt. We talked a bit about the cost-free provisions. Case law impacts that a ton. So these leases get litigated. Judges make calls as to what you can say, how you can say it, and what it truly means. And those attorneys are up to date on that. A great way to kind of know if you've got a good attorney is use a mineral rights form. Ask for recommendations in your area. I'm sure you can find some that way. Also, talk to the attorney. Ask them if they know what the common going royalty rates are. See if they seem informed about that area. And not just any attorney, Matt, like you mentioned. This really needs to be an oil and gas attorney that understands leases and understands oil and gas. Matt, what are some of the other places that folks can go to get information? So you and I both are members of the National Association of Royalty Owners, and that's a wonderful place for people to go to get education. All the chapters have conventions that they do every year that are in-person conventions. Great chance to meet experts in that area, and then also other mineral owners that you can talk to and learn from.
Again, becoming a NARO member, NARO, is really important because we have webinars that are recorded on tips for negotiating the best oil and gas lease. We have in-person events like Justin mentioned. You can join NARO today. We have a coupon code that they are offering our listeners. It's MR Podcast, and you get $25 off your first year of an introductory membership, which brings it down to only $50 a year, or basically the price of a cup of coffee per month. So it's the value you get out of that is many times that. So highly recommended becoming a member of NARO. And then if you're just still trying to figure out exactly what you own, where, the legal descriptions are, what activity is going on in the state, where your minerals are located in the county and the area, and being able to research other leases that are out there through doing basic title work. If you need those skills and you want a step-by-step instruction on that, I have a course that I created called Mineral Management Basics. And you can go find out more about that at mineralrightspodcast.com/courses to find out more about that. And I'll give you the skills to do those things that we talked about today, to find out what others are getting and doing the research of, who's offering leases in your county and et cetera. And then, finally, I will say, just some basic negotiating skills are helpful here. And there's a really good book that I like. It's called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. We'll put a link in the show notes to that book, but it's a great book because it has different tips for negotiating. And so even if you're not into like business negotiations, your day-to-day job, it gives you some things to think about, ways to talk to the landman who's doing this on a day-to-day basis, and they're maybe more skilled at negotiating than you or I are. But if you have these skills or tips, you can help arm yourself to get the best deal possible. So those are some of my favorite resources. Justin, what do you think? What are yours?
Yeah, I think something that mineral owners should be aware of is there are many attorneys. Wade Caldwell is past president of the National Association of Royalty Owners, and his firm is one that will negotiate the lease for you. And I think they work mostly in Texas, but that is always an option. If you're you have your own career, you're doing your own thing, and you're just not sure that you have the time or the bandwidth or the knowledge to do it correctly, that's also an option that you can look for as an attorney who's willing to do that negotiation process. But more than anything, do your research. Even if you're working with an attorney, do your research on what they are saying the terms are, what others are experiencing, and who the operator is. Man, most of the problems we hear from people are from having an operator that's hard to work with. If you're a mineral owner and you have an operator who doesn't respond and won't answer your questions, it can be a very frustrating experience. So if you can impact that, that's a really big lever that I think avoids problems for folks, but that's not always the case for everyone.
Yeah, I'd say unless you're like an extremely large mineral owner in terms of the net interest, who you lease with will dictate who gets to operate the well. In other words, you have a majority of the minerals under a unit that's being proposed. Most of us aren't going to be in that situation, and we'll be sort of having to deal with whoever ends up with that lease. But at the end of the day, again, even if you have a bad operator, quote unquote, it's usually because they try to pass on more post-production deductions to mineral owners, for example, or royalty owners. And so by negotiating a lease with no post-production deductions, you're protecting yourself from those less favorable operators, let's call it. So that's the way around that. If you're not the big, King Ranch, having thousands of acres and dictating whoever you sign with is going to be the operator in that area. Most of us are at the mercy of whoever proposes the well and ends up drilling the well. It's going to be who it is. So again, by negotiating the best terms possible in terms of the highest royalty rates and cost-free language, if at all possible, will protect you from whoever ends up with that lease down the road. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from me, Justin. And again, we'll link to those resources we mentioned where you can do some more research and arm yourself to get the most favorable terms possible in your next oil and gas lease negotiation. So thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.